Hello, everyone. My name is Trenton Mattingly, and I'm the guest speaker for this month's Louisville Young Catholics Distilled Doctrine event. I thank you for listening in, and I hope that there is something of value in what I have to say. So today's topic is, of course, the question, did God cause COVID-19? And although the coronavirus itself is a relatively new phenomenon for us, the larger question at hand really is not. It's been grappled with in other forms for many centuries. I think that when we ask questions like these, what we are really searching for is a solution to the problem of evil. We are seeking what has sometimes been called a theodicy. We are seeking a justification of how there can be evil and suffering in the world, like all the harm that's been brought about by the coronavirus pandemic, when we have a good and loving God. But I want to emphasize that before we dig in, that there's a strong element of mystery in answering this question. But as Catholics, that shouldn't be a disappointment for us to hear, because we know that when we talk about mystery, when we invoke mystery in regard to questions of God, that isn't a synonym for saying, I don't know. It isn't just some lazy response to a difficult question. It isn't a void in response where there should be something. Rather, it's just an acknowledgement that things of God are supremely knowable, but that they are far too vast and far too brilliant to be completely comprehensible to the human mind. After all, God wouldn't be so impressive if we could fit him in his entirety into our finite minds. Thomas Aquinas explains this idea by comparing knowledge of God to a bright light. We need light to move around. We need it to see where we're going, and we need it to comprehend the world around us. But if we were to directly look at the light or be exposed to that light for too long, we would be blinded by it, and then we'd be back to where we started, unable to move about freely and unable to understand much of the world around us. So when we answer questions like what I'm going to try to attempt to answer in this video, keep in mind that we're only able to respond enough to keep from bumping into things in the dark, so to speak. We're only responding enough to help deepen our faith and love of God. There are elements to this question that will never be comprehensible to us, and really, I think that that's a good thing, because it invites us to never stop exploring and wondering about the greatness of our God. But with all that said, I think that we are kind of in a good place to dig in and attempt what we can do to answer the question, did God cause COVID-19? And I think the best place to get a grasp on this, on kind of starting this and answering this question, is to have a recollection of how in the Christian tradition that evil, suffering, and death is understood to have entered our world. I'm sure you're all fairly familiar with it, so I won't spend a ton of time on it. I'll keep it pretty brief, but I do think it's important for us to briefly kind of go over it. So if we take a look at the book of Genesis, we encounter God as he creates all that there is. And this includes the first of humanity, Adam, and of course, shortly after, Eve. And not long after that, we witness their first struggle and first surrender to temptation. They succumb to a false promise that's been presented by Satan. They turn themselves from God deliberately in consuming fruit that they had been forbidden to eat, of course. They dress themselves and they attempt to hide from God, which, of course, they couldn't do. They suffer consequences for their actions, but God doesn't completely abandon them. Instead, he fashions clothing for them and continues a personal relationship with them. And so this narrative illustrates many different things, and we could spend a long time talking about that. But most notably, and most notably in relation to our topic tonight, it illustrates that as Catholic Christians, we hold that the entrance of sin and all of its consequences, including the possibility for something like coronavirus, is a direct result of humanity's original rebellion against God's will for us. I think it's good to be clear that it was not God's plan for us to choose something that was not good for us, and to subsequently, as a result, watch us lead an existence that contains some degree of suffering, no matter who we are, and then eventually die one day, have our souls separated from our material bodies. That was not God's plan. So I think we can say with confidence that had humanity never fallen, we likely would never have heard of coronavirus at all. But I don't think that that narrative quite answers our question at hand, because after all, humanity did fall, and as a result, we now have heard of coronavirus and are experiencing some of the effects from it. And if what Genesis teaches us is true, that although human suffering, including the suffering caused by coronavirus, although that's contrary to what God wanted for us, God does seem to have allowed the world to decay to a point where we can now experience things like this. How can a good God allow such an outcome like this? How can he allow such evil to enter the world? Wouldn't that imply that God created evil, or wouldn't that at least call into question the extent of his goodness? So, luckily for us, this isn't a new thought. This isn't a new doubt that were in the minds of Christians. Let's take a look at one of the greatest fathers of the church, St. Augustine of Hippo, and see what he thought about this. I think it's especially fitting to take a look at Augustine here because he actually himself lived through a time of great plague, and probably actually lived through one that was maybe more serious than the one we're in now. And so he experienced what life was like in the midst of widespread evil and suffering caused by illness. So I think we have a lot to learn from him here. St. Augustine's understanding of evil, the cause of all of our suffering, is that it is not, strictly speaking, a substance or a thing in and of itself. In fact, Augustine actually goes far enough to say that evil doesn't really exist at all. It's just the name that we give to a loss, an absence, or a perversion of something that is good. Which by that, he doesn't mean to imply that evil isn't real. If we look around our world, it very clearly is. He just means that evil is parasitic and that it has no real power or agency of its own without having some form of goodness already present that it's able to pervert. So of course, all analogies are imperfect if you take them too far, especially when we are talking about God, things of God. And I think that'll include this analogy too. But as a teaching tool, St. Augustine uses the example of a wounded or sick animal. He says that when an animal is wounded or sick, it is lacking some amount of goodness. In this case, that would be the goodness of its health. He says that, for example, if the wound heals, that the woundedness doesn't continue to exist independently from the animal. So in the mind of Augustine, if woundedness were a substance in itself, it could continue to exist apart from the animal. And because it can't, because that woundedness ceases when the animal heals, therefore, woundedness would be better understood as a deprivation of the good of health rather than an entity of its own accord. So obviously, with our current understanding of how many illnesses work, and that includes COVID itself, this analogy could be said to be imperfect because, as we know, viruses and bacteria can independently exist after a sickness is no longer present in an individual. One of the challenges that we have been faced with by COVID is that it can survive on surfaces for long periods of time independently. But while that is true, I think that you can still argue that there is a deprivation of something good happening when those substances get involved and affect our health. You're still being deprived of some element of goodness when that happens. And I think that you could also argue, perhaps, that the existence of a virus at all that does harm to human beings could be a deprivation of some other good. But I don't want to get too deep into the strengths and weaknesses of this particular analogy. That would kind of take a really long time and would defeat the purpose of using an analogy at all. But essentially, if we hold a larger point made by it to be true, that evil has no real substance or agency of its own, then we can reconcile that God is good, because you cannot cause something that doesn't truly exist. So if we stop there, which of course we won't do, we could say that God didn't cause COVID. But one problem with stopping there, of course, is that you can easily ask why a good God would create a world where a loss of the good was possible at all. Why would God allow a deprivation of the good of our health to be caused by something like coronavirus? And so I think looking at St. Thomas Aquinas, we will see that he has a good take on this. And he actually takes St. Augustine's position that we just discussed and just adds to it slightly. He argues that a loss of the good is something that, just as a product of our existence, sometimes will just naturally come along as a feature of the presence of good in the world. After all, if our standard for perfection is God himself, then nothing in the created world, nothing that God has created, can be quite as good as God. It is good, but it's not going to be as good, as perfect as God is. And if that's true, that means that there have to be various gradations of good in our world. A Thomistic philosopher that I really like, named Edward Fazer, he illustrates this idea with another analogy involving a lion and a lamb. If a lion were to attack and eat a lamb, the lamb is very clearly experiencing the deprivation of several goods here. It's losing its limbs, its blood, its life, all objectively good things. But on the other hand, the lion is being supplied with its own goods. It's maybe delivering itself and maybe its family from starvation. It's giving it energy to continue hunting or to, create a bigger family, things like that. So in that case, a loss of goodness was something that consequently had to follow from the presence of another good. So if we view things in that light, you could say that God is a cause of coronavirus because it may be a natural feature, a result of a natural law of the world that we live in. But just to be clear, if we understand it in this way, understand that it's only a secondary cause. It's just a feature of goodness that already exists. It isn't positively willed by God. It's just permitted by God. And I think that this can help us, help reconcile for us, again, that God can certainly be said to be good, despite the reality of evil. Despite the reality of goods can be deprived of, despite the reality that some goods can be deprived of their goodness. But I do acknowledge that there could be some surface level difficulty in kind of applying this theory, this rhetoric to coronavirus. And just as a side note, I also think there are some pastoral considerations to keep in mind here. If you consider that it maybe isn't the best idea to bring up positive benefits in the midst of great suffering, but I'll address that further later on. But I do think that to a degree that this could still apply to our question at hand. For example, consider that scientists have been able to demonstrate that although rare, viruses can and have altered human DNA in the past. It's more often in negative ways, but it has also occurred in some very notably positive ways. So, for example, there's evidence to show that ancient viruses are responsible for adjusting human DNA to a place where we are able to more strongly resist some other diseases and develop the ability to digest foods that we previously couldn't consume. And that would include starches, for example. And those things, of course, are objectively good. There is some kind of economy, some sort of exchange of goods happening there. And so for any of you pasta lovers out there, you kind of have a virus to thank for your ability to enjoy that food. But admittedly, occurrences like that are pretty rare. And when it comes to disease and many other sufferings in our world, it probably is hard to come up with a consistent positive trade-off of goods that occurs in the face of deprivations of goods. So let's not leave it there, and also consider some of the less obvious trade-offs that may occur in the face of a loss or deprivation of good. Going back to Augustine again, he often preached that sin and its consequences, like coronavirus, as strange as it sounds, does have a certain utility to God. And don't get me wrong here, God hates sin. That's, completely true. God hates sin. And like we've already said, God has never desired for sin, for humanity to sin. God has never desired suffering for humanity either. But as St. Paul once wrote in the book of Romans, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. Augustine says that God judged it better to bring goodness out of evil rather than to simply not permit evil to occur at all. And this is partly why we can read an ancient sermon each year during the Easter Vigil that calls Adam and Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden a felix culpa, a happy fault. Because of the sin of Adam and Eve, God eventually walked among us. We got to experience the blessings of the incarnation. Because of their fault, we were given a glorious Redeemer and all the blessings that have come about as a result of that. And all that's to say that when we sin and suffer as human beings, the more opportunities we have to turn and rely upon God more fully. We are presented with more opportunities to grow in virtue and prepare ourselves to become good citizens of the kingdom of heaven and become good citizens of the kingdom of God. So, in other words, God permits us to sin, God permits us to suffer, but only when it can bring about a greater good. And as far as coronavirus goes, and as awful as it is, I can still think of several good things that may have been brought forth from it. For example, a lot of people, at least early on, were getting to spend a lot more time with their family because of lockdowns and working from home. I think a lot of people also learned to have a greater appreciation for some of the simple things in life, like simply having a job, being able to visit a vulnerable grandparent, or to go to places where lots of other people are, like a restaurant, a grocery store, mass. I think it taught a lot of people to more fully rely upon God and reprioritize what is most important in this life. I think it shattered a lot of people's illusion that they were in full control of their lives or that they could go on living the life that they're living now as if it were going to go on forever. I think that in the midst of death and suffering, that people are brought back to the reality that they too will die one day. And as we know, that often turns people's thoughts to God. And historically, we've seen that many saints have started down their path to holiness as a result of becoming deathly ill, as a result of almost dying. So we probably don't see this clearly yet, but I think it's quite possible, quite likely, that coronavirus has probably helped to produce a legion of future saints, not only of people that got sick and just realized how important God was, but also of people that responded to the evils of coronavirus and the suffering that it caused and sprang into action out of a love of God. That creates saints too. And, later on in life, we may see how many saints have started down their path of holiness because of this virus, because of this pandemic. And if, in case you think I'm just barking up a tree, I'm just saying crazy things here, I think there's good evidence to support what I'm saying in Scripture too. For example, I think that there are a lot of parallels here with the people of Israel in the book of Exodus shortly after they were freed from slavery in Egypt. They wandered and suffered in the desert for 40 years. And although their struggles were extraordinary, and we can't minimize how deep their suffering was, think of some of the goods that came forth as a result of their suffering. The people of Israel, through Moses, were given revelations from God. They also learned to more fully rely upon God. After all, they had to get their daily manna in the desert from God. That takes a lot of reliance to literally expect your daily bread from God. They were also taught to have a better and more personal relationship with God through being given the 10 Commandments. And many of them, when they finally arrived in the Promised Land, when they finally arrived in Canaan, they were able to experience kind of a material bounty, which I'd imagine that instead of abusing, they probably had a much greater appreciation for after wandering in the desert for so many years. And I think when we consider the goodness that comes out of their sufferings, we can maybe start to understand why God may have thought it was better to bring good out of evil rather than just not to permit evil to occur at all. But with that said, I just want to clarify that we should be very careful when talking about these realities, when we talk about the truth that God can bring good out of suffering. There are just some important pastoral considerations to kind of keep before us. And it is, I do just want to emphasize, I do think it's absolutely true that God does bring goodness out of bad things, but sometimes the goodness that comes out of a bad thing is not immediately or ever evident to us. And the goodness that may come out of the suffering may not be proportionate to the person that is experiencing the suffering. Or perhaps the goodness won't be experienced in this life at all, and it may just come afterwards in the next life when we inherit the kingdom of heaven. For example, do you think that anyone who has lost their job due to COVID and can no longer provide for their family is going to easily appreciate the fact that they were able to spend more time at home and to spend more time with their family? I have a feeling that this may be a good that they probably feel that they could have done without. Or do you think that anyone who has lost a relative to the virus is going to as easily appreciate the comment that at least their relative is in heaven now? Again, I have a feeling that, at least in the moment, they would probably prefer that their relative was still with them here and now instead, and that, if it was the relative's time to go anyway, that at least that it could have occurred during a time where we were under more normal circumstances and we're able to see them in the hospital with lots of other family and surround them with family and friends. Or to go back to our example about the Israelites in the desert. Consider that many of the Israelites never got to see the promised land. They suffered in the desert for decades, and some of them endured many years of slavery in a foreign land prior to that, and then they died before they ever got to see the benefits of all that suffering. And even those that did get to see some of the benefits of that suffering, it took 40 long years for them to see it. That's a really long time. And so I now, I don't think that these realities that I've just mentioned minimize the truth behind the statement that God does bring good things out of suffering and that God can bring good out of COVID. I just think that these things, I do think that those things are true, but I just want to bring that up to encourage us from being too candid with this idea, most especially when someone is in the midst of suffering, because it just really isn't as simple as it sounds. And it also definitely isn't as comforting as it sounds, and it also just doesn't do justice to the mystery that surrounds the question we've explored tonight. We have some good reasons for why God permits suffering in our world, but to say that we can understand that fully is just incorrect. And so to confidently always say that, suffering isn't important because God will bring good out of it, that just doesn't do full justice to the full mystery of what we're talking about. And so there may be a better time later on to have a discussion with someone that's suffering about the truths that we've discussed tonight. But for the most part, in the meantime, while they're in the midst of suffering, I'd probably just suggest being there for them. Just continue being a good friend. Assure them of God's love. Ease their load where you can. Make their life a little bit easier for a while where you have the ability to do that. Pray with them. Pray for them. Don't minimize their suffering. Don't minimize all the other suffering that we see in the world. I just don't think things are as black and white as it may be tempting to understand. So that's my talk for the night. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope I didn't ramble too much. And if you didn't enjoy the talk, I hope that you remember that God can bring good things out of suffering. So listening to this video hopefully wasn't a zero-sum game for you. But just to add, before I leave you, if this is a topic that was interesting to you, I'd really suggest reading the Confessions of St. Augustine. That's where I got a good portion of the information for my talk tonight. I'd also suggest looking up the Thomistic Institute. It's an organization that I'm a really big fan of. And they recently recorded a lecture called "Is COVID-19 a Punishment from God?" That is a slightly different spin on the question that we discussed tonight, but it comes from a Dominican friar that is much more intelligent, knowledgeable, and eloquent than myself, and I think that you may get a lot out of that talk. I'd also recommend looking up the University of Notre Dame's research initiative from several years ago called "The Problem of Evil in Modern and Contemporary Thought." It has just a wide variety of resources. A lot of time, money, and effort went into that project. And that it also has a nice series of videos from some prominent thinkers, and they explore this issue in greater detail. So thank you again, and God bless.